All right, nearly 2 hours, just 15 minutes short of 2 hours. The state begins its closing with Steve Slisher. Let's bring in Court TV legal correspondent Chanley Painter watching along with us, anchoring our early morning coverage here on Court TV. This was detailed. It was long. He talked about the law. He talked about the witnesses, and he was thorough. Nobody could argue that.
That's right. I think it was a great time to take a break for the jury, but what a way to begin. The very first words out of his mouth was the name of George Floyd. His name was George Perry Floyd Jr., bringing this case back to what it's about. George Floyd. It reminds me of what we hear a lot outside the courthouse here, which is say his name, George Floyd. And that was a way to really humanize him. And I felt that was kind of a new theme throughout the closing argument, was the humanization of George Floyd. He said it wasn't superhuman strength. This isn't about superhumans. This was a human. And so I love that he was centering a lot of it around the humanity. But also, Ted, we heard a lot of the same themes from Jerry Blackwell's opening statement. He didn't let up. He didn't get up. The cause of death, the use of force, and a lot of new themes that he carried through, which was this wasn't common sense. This was nonsense. And I thought it was masterful how he walked through each of the charges, specifically each element of every count against Derek Chauvin, and told the jury how they met each element beyond a reasonable doubt using the visual aids, which I think is helpful to a jury because that's what they're going to have to go back through and do when they start deliberating.
Absolutely, and he was able to use those visual aids in a way that seemed to be just perfectly placed to break up his close with not only the visual aids but the video, reminding the jury of what they've been through for the past 3 weeks, of all of the different witnesses that came in. He was able to get the majority of his 38 witnesses in somehow, some way, to remind them and bring that he knew better, he didn't do better. A lot more of where we're going, and I'm sure again Jerry Blackwell is going to deliver the rebuttal, so he will have the last word in this, and we'll get more of it as we move through there. Also with us, Richard St. Paul is in New York City. He's a criminal defense attorney, and Kirk Davis is in Seattle, Washington, criminal defense attorney as well. Richard, your thoughts on this closing from Steve Slisher, keeping in mind that this is just the setup and Jerry Blackwell will finish and close after the defense.
I mean, wow. Wow. I mean, you talk about details, you talk about laying out a case from beginning to end, you talk about supporting the evidence with witness statements, just reminding the jury about what they heard, kind of like opening statement, where you get a roadmap of what we're going to prove and how we're going to prove it. And then at closing, you have that same roadmap saying that this is what we proved and this is how we proved it. It was masterful, absolutely. And I think the theme of this is, if the prosecution, which they do have a theme, but if you didn't recognize it, it is Chauvin would not get up or let up, which led to the death of George Floyd.
Yeah. Kirk, usually you'd say after an hour you're going to lose the jury. Was he able to pull off a almost 2-hour close without losing jurors, do you think? It had a few lulls, but for the most part, he seemed to, using the visual aids, using the different themes, he seemed to pull it off.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the crucible, isn't it? I mean, this is what we as lawyers go to law school for. This is the opportunity. This goes back to our ancestors and telling stories around the campfire. This is the way to capture people's attention. And what our ancestors didn't have is video. What our ancestors didn't have is movies. So this was an excellent way to use that storytelling with video of what actually happened, really being able to see and use that emotion. And I thought he was good because, I was a former prosecutor, and sometimes you can let your emotions overcome you in this situation because you feel the righteousness of your cause. You feel like it is so obvious and you want everyone to see. And why can't they see? And you're trying to convince them of that. And so you have to remember who you are. You are a representative of the state. You must control your emotions and present it. I thought he did a very good job.
All right, we're going to step aside, take a break. Coming up next will be the defense. Eric Nelson is in the hot seat. He is going over what he will say to this jury, and this will be his last attempt. There is the seal of the great state of Minnesota. As soon as they're back in that courtroom, we'll get you back. You won't miss a thing. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
We know how George Floyd died. This is the use of force. When we talk about use of force, that's been defined by the different witnesses who've testified, looking at what happened from the point the knee went to the neck and back, right, and the unlawful restraint, the assault started, and how long it lasted, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. That's what that's what killed George Floyd. That's why he died. You believe your eyes. That unreasonable force pinning him to the ground, that's what killed him.
Welcome back to Court TV Live. The court is in a short recess before defense attorney Eric Nelson addresses the jury for the final time before deliberations begin. Before the break, prosecutor Steve Slisher delivered the first part of the state's closing argument.
And in that time and in that place, while he was surrounded in life by people he knew him, faces he could pick out, there was no one there he knew. He was surrounded by strangers. Strangers, all of them. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He's surrounded by strangers, not a familiar face to say his final words. But he did say them to someone. He said them to someone who he did not know by name, but he knew him from the uniform he wore and the badge he wore. And he called him Mr. Officer. That's what he called him, Mr. Officer. Mr. Officer would help. We call the police when we need help. And he pleaded with Mr. Officer. George Floyd's final words on May 25, 2020 were, "Please, I can't breathe." And he said those words to Mr. Officer. He said those words to the defendant.
Still with us in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Court TV legal correspondent Chanley Painter and trial attorneys Richard St. Paul and civil attorney and former prosecutor Kirk Davis. Chanley, Eric Nelson has his work cut out for him.
He sure does. And I'm sure he prepared. He had a long weekend to prepare. This is something as attorneys you work on from day one, building your closing argument based on what's happened during the last 3 weeks of the trial. So I imagine that he is prepared. He sat there at the table as if he was prepared during this entire hour and 45 minutes or so of Steve Slisher's first closing for the prosecution, taking some notes every now and then, but he seemed to be sitting there pretty confidently, Ted. And I think he's going to take his time and redirect the narrative here. And I'm wondering if he's going to also use some visual aids and demonstrative aids, because that seems to be effective with this jury. In fact, I just got handed some of the poll reporter notes from openings this morning, and the jurors seem enthralled by Slisher's closing argument, taking notes, especially at the beginning, kind of weighing towards the end. But particularly, I'm scanning through, juror number 2 seemed to be almost hanging on every word of Steve Slisher. So they are ready to work today, the jury is.
Richard St. Paul, when you're in this situation, you're listening to the other side deliver a close, and they're really, really, really good. Does that ramp up the nerves and get you in a different spot? Where is Eric Nelson right now, and what does he have to do?
He's got to create reasonable doubt. Look, the difficulty here, and not like other places where the prosecution goes and the defense goes, that's it. But the prosecution gets a rebuttal, so that's 2 bites at the apple, which makes his job even more difficult, right? So he's got to show that reasonable doubt. He's got to take, I think it was Dr. Fowler's information, and show that the cause of death was something other than Officer Chauvin's putting his knee on George Floyd's back and neck, that the cause of death was the enlarged heart, and it was the drugs. And he's got to harp on that. He's got to go not only through that, but he's got to show that the training that Officer Chauvin, that in his training, that this was the proper training in trying to stop a potential assailant or somebody who's been accused of crime and that's under arrest from resisting arrest. And so the force he had to use was in line with his training. So he's got two things to show: that the death was not caused by Officer Chauvin, and that Officer Chauvin, what he did was within the training.
Kirk, what do you do if you're the defense?
I agree 100% with Richard, and I thought his phrasing was very interesting there. He said that this is what the defense has to show, and that's the way we feel right now. That's the way we feel, because it's like the prosecution has taken a sledgehammer to all of the defenses. They're just in pieces. And now it feels like, even though the burden is on the government, it feels like Mr. Nelson has got to put together this pottery vase with a bunch of glue and try to put it back together. And it seems like a very, very difficult job for him at this time.
Chanley, the defense did not use the video during the openings. It was just sort of bare bones. But over the course of this trial, it's fair to say that Eric Nelson has developed a relationship with this jury. What do you think in terms of timing and whether or not he will step it up a notch, given the long weekend he had to prepare? And what do you see the state do?
You make a good point. The jury has only seen Eric Nelson for the defense from day one when they walk in as prospective jurors to now this final closing argument. That is the face of the defense, the face of Derek Chauvin. I think he's going to be mindful that it's coming up on lunchtime here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They may be getting a snack right now, and they've probably been told that they're going to take a late lunch today, but to be mindful of their time. This was a long closing for the prosecution. I think it is narrow in on the issues, keep it simple for them, make it plain, respect their time. And like you said, I think that connection is important. It's different to see an attorney only stay behind the podium, and they have to because of the plexiglass there, the COVID restrictions and spacing in the courtroom. So I think he will use some sort of visual aid just because his experts, some of his witnesses use some visual aids. So maybe he can resurrect those and remind the jury about their case.
Absolutely. Again, Steve Schlischer almost goes 2 hours, an hour and 45 minutes, which is typically a little longer than you would want to go, but he pulled it off masterfully, and now it is up to Eric Nelson and the defense. We're going to slip in a quick break. Before that begins, we'll get you back into the courtroom before he begins his closing argument on behalf of his client, Derek Chauvin.